The subject is the rescue of downed B-29 crewmen in inland China in 1944-1945 and the role that monks and local guides played in moving airmen from parachute landing sites to friendly control. The operational frame is the activation of the 20th Air Force on 4 April 1944, the initiation of Operation Matterhorn with XX Bomber Command, staging B-29s from India to forward fields around Chengdu, and the strategic pressure created by Operation Ichi-Go from May to December 1944. The forward bases commonly referenced in U.S. records are Xinqing, A-1, Quanghan, A-3, Qinglai, A4, and Pengshan, A5. Sorties to Kyushu and Manchuria required fuel and ordnance ferried over the Himalayas by Air Transport Command on the hump route. Early engine reliability problems on Wright R-3350s, severe icing and turbulence at altitude, and long return legs after night takeoffs or recoveries produced a significant incidence of forced landings and bailouts over provinces west and south of the Chengdu Plain. In parallel, the Imperial Japanese Army's Ichi-Go offensive pushed through Henan, Hunan, and Guangxi, disrupted rail and road corridors, and generated an intensified pattern of sweeps, checkpoints, and Kempeitai interviews in market towns and clinics. This environment shaped how civilians, including monastic communities, could assist Allied personnel. The rescue architecture relied on the Air-Ground Aid Section under the 14th Air Force in China, on OSS liaison parties, and on the Sino-American Cooperative Organization network that provided coast-watching, meteorology, and courier channels. AGAS briefed crews before missions, issued silk escape maps covering CBI sectors, blood chits printed in Chinese that promised thanks and reward for assistance to Allied airmen, phrase cards with key sentences for asking for food and safe conduct, small compasses, mirrors, survival rations, and basic medical supplies such as sulfa and morphine syrets. The standard guidance covered dispersal after parachute landings, avoidance of main roads and market squares, use of ridge lines and dikes for movement, the value of waiting for darkness before approaching settlements, and the need to respect local leaders who controlled whether help would be extended. Many of the first contacts were not with formal agents, but with farmers, boatmen, mission staff, and monks who moved routinely between hamlets and could shelter a foreigner without conspicuous purchases or gatherings. The monastic contribution is recorded indirectly in escape and evasion statements and in 14th Air Force summaries that mention temples, abbots, and students at mission schools who hid or escorted flyers. In practice, monasteries had attributes that made them effective waypoints. Their daily schedules were predictable, which meant a stranger could be absorbed into routine without creating noise in the village rumor system. They kept stores of rice and vegetables and maintained herb plots and simple clinics, which reduced the need to buy food or medicine that might alert shopkeepers. They sat on spurs above the terraced country and could watch patrol roads from a distance. Some abbots possessed relationships with gentry families, militia heads, or Christian mission heads and could request safe conduct without disclosing names. The refusal of monks to carry weapons often lowered suspicion at impromptu searches because armed escorts were what patrols expected to find. A composite case based on multiple China E&E statements is assignable to the first half of December 1944. A B-29 staging through Pengshan on a return leg from a Kyushu target reported an engine fire and separation from formation. The crew initiated bailouts in darkness west of the Chengdu basin. The navigator retained a silk map, and the radio operator carried a blood chit and mirror. The pilot recorded a last fix and ordered men to avoid settlements and regroup on high ground after dawn. Landing dispersion placed 2 men on ridges and 1 in an irrigation pocket near terraced paddies. A monk encountered one airman on a morning alms route when a section of parachute canopy was visible among reeds. The monk brought water, checked limbs, and chose to approach his abbot rather than draw a crowd. The abbot placed the foreigner in an outer guest cell and requested that the bell be rung only at canonical hours to avoid anomalous patterns. A splint was improvised with bamboo slats and cloth. Rice gruel and tea were supplied without market purchases. At dusk, a river pilot known to the monastery and a youth courier visited the outer gate using a token that matched a prearranged mark used by local couriers. This detail aligns with OSS and AGAS practice for confirming identity without extended conversation. The Japanese search pattern in this sector typically began with attempts to locate canopy silk, followed by visits to clinics and mills where strangers could be noticed through purchases or gossip, and finally by review of ferries and bridges. Patrols questioned school staff and midwives and used local auxiliaries. The memory of reprisals after the Doolittle Raiders traversed Zhejiang and Jiangxi in 1942 made residents cautious about visible aid to airmen. In the December case, the monastery absorbed a second crewman on the evening of the first day, when a field hand who had seen the monk on the ridge quietly followed and reported that another foreigner had moved toward the pine spur. Payment in kind was made from abbey stores in the form of salt and cloth. No names were recorded on paper to avoid evidentiary trails. The abbot continued normal alms rounds for novices, a routine that created cover traffic on village paths and prevented the impression that the monastery had closed its gates for reasons other than prayer. Movement began on the second night. The injured airman's ankle was bound and his load reduced to personal documents, the escape map folded inside his jacket, and a small ration. The group moved in single file with interval spacing and halted at a point known for white water, where the noise of the river masked voices and small accidents. A lamp code consisting of 2 short coverings and 1 long covering confirmed the correct junk. The junk crew concealed the foreigners under woven mats and baskets of sweet potatoes, a technique that made the deck look like a routine produce shipment. At a riverside checkpoint, the talking was left to the boat pilot, a woman in her 30s. Social expectations created less scrutiny of her baskets than of a group of young men. The boat drifted at gray light and tied up at a minor ferry town where an AGAS contact, functioning in public as a school clerk, received the party in a mission clinic courtyard. A runner or hand-crank radio alerted the nearest 14th Air Force detachment. By evening, a truck moved the men to a forward strip. Medical checks preceded transit to Kunming or back to Pengshan. The debrief captured route segments, timings, checkpoint behavior, and the pattern of patrol sweeps in nearby townships. Intelligence officers updated route books with friendly hamlets, reliable ferries and fords, and the names or aliases of facilitators when disclosure posed no risk. The wider operational context explains why such rescues were frequent. The first China-based B-29 raid on Japan targeted the Yawata Steel Complex on 15 June 1944. Subsequent sorties against Kyushu targets and Manchurian industrial nodes occurred through the summer and autumn, alternating with missions against shipping and yards in Asia. The supply mathematics of Matterhorn were unfavorable. Several tons had to be flown over the hump to deliver a single ton to a forward base. Weather and the R-3350's early thermal issues contributed to turnbacks and mechanical failures. LeMay assumed command of XX Bomber Command on 29 August 1944 and introduced changes in formation, bomb loading, and climb, but attrition from non-combat causes remained. In the same period, Ichigo threatened or overran airfields and transport links in central China, increasing the density of Japanese units and collaborationist auxiliaries on the ground. This forced AGAS and Chinese partners to favor ridge lines, secondary river landings, and religious houses as holding points rather than market towns or obvious depots. The equipment carried by downed men appears consistently in statements. Blood chits with Chinese text were either sewn to jackets or carried as separate panels, and were sometimes stamped with official seals. Silk escape maps folded silently and resisted water. Small mirrors, whistles, and compasses served for signaling and orientation. Rations were meager but useful for one night's movement. Medical kits provided sulfa and morphine syrettes. In monasteries and mission clinics, these were combined with herbal poultices and splints. Phrase cards allowed a basic exchange of goodwill when an interpreter was absent. The doctrine stressed patience, stillness during daylight, and movement when dogs and men were less active. When contact with organized help occurred, the instruction was to follow local direction and avoid attempting to command the process. Risk to helpers remained significant throughout 1944 and into 1945. Japanese proclamations in county seats criminalized aid to enemy personnel and threatened execution or collective penalties. Stories of earlier punitive operations were well known. Countermeasures consisted of paying in kind rather than with signed vouchers, avoiding congregations while a flyer was in shelter, and distributing movement across more than one family and more than one night. Monastic economies were particularly suited to this environment because they could feed people from stores and because monks could explain travel at odd hours as religious duties. The existence of mission compounds with clinics and schools provided additional neutral spaces where foreigners did not stand out among existing networks of patients and students. The transition of the main B-29 effort from China to the Marianas late in 1944 and early in 1945 reduced the flow of Matterhorn crews through Sichuan, but did not eliminate rescues of Allied flyers over China proper. The 14th Air Force maintained operations against river shipping, rail nodes, and airfields. AGAS continued to collect and analyze escape narratives, update route sheets, and brief crews. In several cases, E&E interviews document that monasteries acted as first contact points or holding points before transfer to river pilots or militia escorts. The pattern repeats: discovery by someone who moves routinely across villages, silent shelter in a location with predictable rhythms, night movement that uses loud water or rain to cloak sound, and handover to a clerk or medic who has an established reason to meet unknown people. The presence of a monk does not eliminate danger. It lowers the profile and shortens the time between landing and extraction. A plausible daily rhythm for a rescue sequence in December 1944 illustrates the method. Day 1 begins before dawn with parachute descents along a ridge. A monk on an alms route observes canopy silk and brings water and cloth. The abbot permits holding the foreigner in an outer cell and restricts the bell schedule to normal hours to avoid signaling change. In the evening, a river pilot and a youth courier visit the side gate and confirm identity using a token. A second airman reaches shelter with help from a field hand. Day 2 includes limited internal movement at the monastery, no public purchases, continuation of routine alms, a discreet payment in salt and cloth, and reconnaissance of patrol positions based on rumors from a mill and from a midwife who saw soldiers near a ferry. Night 2 covers the contour march to the Whitewater Bend, the lamp code, concealment on the junk, and a quiet drift toward a ferry town. Day 3 involves the mission clinic, a call to a 14th Air Force contact, movement by truck to a forward strip, and medical checks before transfer. The debrief captures timings, geographic features, the number and disposition of patrols, and the behavior of checkpoint personnel when meeting a female boat pilot versus a group of young men. Within this dry pattern sit a few consistent human elements. Monastic communities ration speech and make decisions by rule, which reduces errors under pressure. River pilots and ferrymen understand how to present cargo and people to minimize scrutiny. School clerks and mission nurses provide bureaucratic or medical cover for presence in a compound. Farmers and field hands act when risk and empathy balance and are influenced by local standing of the monastery or mission. American officers conducting debriefs compile these actions into route books and training notes that in turn raise the survival odds for later crews. The process is iterative and cumulative. The effect of these rescues is operational as well as humanitarian because the return of trained B-29 crewmen preserves experience inside units that are still adapting tactics and procedures, and because each interview refines understanding of enemy search behavior and friendly geography. By spring 1945, the Matterhorn complex around Chengdu had receded in priority as Saipan and Tinian absorbed most B-29 operations, but the logic of rescue through low-profile civilian networks remained valid across China. The monk on a ridge near terraced fields, the river pilot who knows where loud water masks words, the clerk who owns a hand-crank radio, and the mission nurse who writes a plausible admission note represent a reproducible system that appears across multiple statements in slightly different forms. The dates shift and the names change, but the sequence repeats often enough to constitute a pattern. Parachute, concealment in a predictable household or religious routine, movement under noise cover, transfer in a neutral compound, and return to an airstrip under 14th Air Force supervision. The historical significance is not in a single dramatic rescue, but in the reliability of an improvised method that connected downed men to organized extraction during the most difficult phase of the China-based B-29 campaign. An expanded account of the operational preconditions provides additional clarity. The 20th Air Force existed as a separate strategic instrument under direct control of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Its XX Bomber Command carried the burden of proving the B-29 concept in combat from suboptimal geography before the Marianas airfields were ready. The Chengdu project required the construction and expansion of runways with crushed stone and hand labor supplied by Chinese authorities, and it demanded a flow of gasoline, bombs, and spare parts that could be delivered only by repeated hump sorties. Every long-range mission consumed fuel that had itself been lifted by C-46 and C-47 transports over terrain where icing, downdrafts, and navigational difficulty were routine. This made aircraft availability and crew endurance fragile. When an engine ran hot or a fire warning illuminated in the climb, the safest outcome still risked a descent over mountain country with minimal infrastructure. The Japanese countermeasures matured through the summer of 1944, patrol schedules adapted to reported bailout zones. Kempeitai detachments learned to read the behavior of markets for anomalies such as sudden demand for bandages or rice by families not known to have guests. Collaborationist police were embedded in ferry operations, curfews were enforced in towns, while rural patrols relied on informers and guides who knew terraces and dikes. The history of the Zhejiang-Jiangxi punitive campaign of 1942 created a deterrent memory that the occupation authorities did not hesitate to evoke when they posted proclamations warning of punishment for assistance to enemy flyers. Against this backdrop, the monk's role remains practical rather than symbolic. His capacity to walk without comment, to accept food and give blessings at odd hours, and to move between hamlets with a bowl and a bundle constitutes a low-visibility courier function. He does not carry a weapon and does not issue orders. He moves knowledge by deciding whom to inform and when to remain silent. When a flyer is hidden in an outer cell, the monk enforces quiet not by threat, but by habit. Bells ring at the usual times. Fires light at the usual times. The abbey maintains its own supply of rice and greens and does not visit the market while a guest is present. If a patrol arrives, the guest is already gone or is being moved that night to the river bend where water conceals footsteps and speech. The monks' refusal to engage in drama is the point. Routine is the defense. Additional examples, drawn from scattered E&E summaries and contemporaneous diaries, repeat the same logic in other provinces. In Hunan, during September 1944, a transport aircraft crewman attached to a forward support mission was brought to a hillside school run by missionaries where a local preacher arranged a handover to militia who escorted him by night to a road watched by a 14th Air Force contact. The presence of hymn books and school uniforms created a frame in which foreigners were not anomalous. In Guangxi in late October, a fighter pilot who bellied in near a karst formation was hidden in a lime kiln by quarry workers for 36 hours until a river flood receded enough to float a sampan under a bridge with minimal noise. In Sichuan in early January 1945, a trio of airmen were dispersed among 3 farm compounds separated by half a mile and were rotated at dusk to confuse any single informer. The rotation terminated only when a courier confirmed that a truck could meet them at a small strip briefly secured by provincial troops. The material culture of escape deserves attention because it conditions behavior. Silk maps are quiet objects. They do not crease loudly and can be folded inside clothing. Mirrors and whistles allow signaling at a distance without shouting. Blood chits communicate a political promise through printed characters and seals, and this removes the need for the airman to speak while still conveying intent and affiliation. Small medical kits containing sulfa or morphine bridge the gap between herbal poultices and modern antisepsis in environments where clinics lacked supplies. The phrase cards substitute written memory for oral skill and reduce the risk of mispronounced words that could offend. The kit does not guarantee rescue, but creates a toolkit for respectful, low-profile movement while waiting for local networks to decide. Extraction endpoints varied. Kunming functioned as a hub for the 14th Air Force, and airmen brought there were quickly absorbed into medical and intelligence flows. Some men returned to Pengshan or to other Chengdu fields for reassignment or evacuation to India. Debriefs followed a persistent structure that treated each rescue as a data source. Interviewers asked for compass bearings, durations between fixed points, the presence of dogs at certain farms, the types of questions asked at checkpoints, the accent or uniform details of patrols, and the reliability of persons described only by craft or alias. The analytical output was a set of route notes that could be issued again at briefings, emphasizing which hamlets were safe at dusk and which ferries to avoid after market day. The product was not dramatic and rarely made public narratives, but it was the layer that turned initial improvisation into a learned procedure. The moral risk for Chinese helpers remained a structural fact. The safest payment was no payment at all, but when compensation occurred, it tended to be in salt, cloth, needles, simple tools, or help with harvest work to avoid monetary records. Names were avoided. In some cases, the helper preferred that the airman sign nothing, and that no Allied officer ever attempt to return a written certificate to the village. This erased the chance that a document could be seized later. Where Christian missions were involved, the presence of baptismal registers and school rosters created paper that could explain foreigners entering a compound, but even there the entries did not identify rescued flyers by name. The defining rule was to leave as few traces as possible while still recording enough data in Allied channels to refine the next rescue. As the Marianas Campaign accelerated in 1945 and LeMay altered tactics to low-level night firebombing from Saipan and Tinian, the China element of the strategic bombing effort diminished. Yet the experience gained in 1944 retained value as a manual of civil-military cooperation under occupation. The figure of the monk is representative of a class of actors that included priests, teachers, midwives, clerks, fishermen, and ferrymen. Each contributed a routine already accepted by the occupier. Each could insert an abnormal task, such as sheltering a foreigner for a single night, within that routine without drawing attention. The cumulative effect was a functioning corridor that did not look like a corridor at all when viewed from checkpoint level. Patrols sought columns of men and wheels in motion. What they encountered instead were bells at the usual hour, boats with vegetables, students at a clinic, and an old man with a bowl walking the same path he had walked every week. The composite December 1944 case, when expanded to full granularity, offers a final set of timings that resemble those recorded on E&E forms. The bailout occurs at approximately 03:20 local time. First ground contact occurs around 06:10 when an alms route intersects a terrace gully. The injured man is under shelter by 07:0. A second man reaches the monastery after 18:30. The party departs the monastery on night 2 after final bell at 21:0. The river rendezvous occurs between 23:30 and midnight. The junk drifts at first light and ties up at a ferry town by 08:0. The A-gas contact is located by 10:30. A truck departs for the forward strip at 17 wall. The airmen are airborne to Kunming by 20 Hus. None of these numbers are fixed. They reflect the common effort to move when sound is masked, when attention is elsewhere, and when schedules produce plausible reasons for presence in certain courtyards. It is the plausibility that protects the actors as much as the physical terrain. A monk walking at dawn is not unusual. A boat with produce at a checkpoint is not unusual. A school clerk meeting unfamiliar men in a clinic courtyard is not unusual if a delivery of bandages is expected. The method is to hide the extraordinary inside the ordinary until the moment of transfer. The cumulative record from 1944 to early 1945 supports a sober conclusion. The rescue of downed B-29 airmen in inland China depended less on isolated feats than on a mesh of predictable routines owned by civilians who calculated risk hour by hour. The routines belonged to households, missions, and monasteries rather than to military formations. The Allied contribution was to brief crews, to carry the right tools, to listen to local direction, and to harvest each experience into improved instructions. The Japanese contribution, unintentionally, was to enforce a surveillance system that expected loud movements and thereby allowed quiet ones to pass. Within that space, the monk's bell continued to ring at the same time each day, a fixed point around which a temporary corridor for strangers could be traced without a map, without a ledger, and without a name.